Douglas MacArthur was an American military icon and one of the most controversial figures in the nation's history. A brilliant strategist, a theatrical personality, and a commander of extraordinary ability, MacArthur's life spanned nearly a century of American history and touched three major wars. Born into a military family on January 26, 1880 at the Little Rock Barracks in Arkansas, Douglas MacArthur seemed destined from birth to become a soldier. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., was a distinguished Army officer who would eventually rise to the rank of Lieutenant General and receive the Medal of Honor for his Civil War service. His mother, Mary Pinckney Hardy MacArthur, came from a prominent Southern family and was a woman of fierce ambition and determination. She would shape her son's character and drive his ambitions throughout his life. Young Douglas grew up on military posts across the American frontier. His childhood was spent among soldiers, learning military customs and absorbing the culture of the Army. His father's career took the family to various posts in the West, and Douglas witnessed firsthand the closing of the American frontier. These early years instilled in him a deep respect for military tradition and a sense that he was born to lead soldiers. His mother was the dominant influence in his early life. She was ambitious for her son, determined that he would surpass even his father's accomplishments. She instilled in him a sense of destiny, a belief that he was meant for greatness. This maternal influence created in MacArthur both extraordinary confidence and a deep need for recognition and approval that would mark his entire career. MacArthur's education was carefully managed by his mother. He attended the West Texas Military Academy, where he excelled both academically and in military drill. His mother had set her sights on West Point for her son, and she prepared him relentlessly for the entrance examinations. In 1899, MacArthur entered the United States Military Academy at West Point. His mother moved to a hotel near the academy to be close to him during his cadet years, an unusual arrangement that demonstrated her determination to oversee his success. At West Point, MacArthur was a brilliant student. He graduated first in his class in 1903 with one of the highest academic records in the Academy's history. He also served as first captain, the highest-ranking cadet position. His academic achievement was matched by his performance in military subjects and leadership exercises. He seemed to be the perfect cadet, the ideal young officer. But even at West Point, MacArthur showed the traits that would later make him controversial. He was aloof from his fellow cadets, maintaining a distance that some interpreted as arrogance. He was intensely competitive and could not bear to be second in anything. He had already developed the sense of superiority and destiny that would characterize his entire career. After graduation, Second Lieutenant MacArthur was assigned to the Corps of Engineers and sent to the Philippines, where his father was serving as a senior commander. The Philippines had recently been acquired by the United States following the Spanish-American War, and the Army was engaged in suppressing an insurgency. MacArthur's first taste of combat came during operations against Filipino guerrillas. He participated in several expeditions into hostile territory and demonstrated physical courage and tactical skill. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions, though the award was not approved at that time. MacArthur's early career followed the typical pattern for a promising young officer. He served in various engineering assignments, attended the engineer school, and worked on construction projects. But he was restless in these peacetime duties, eager for opportunities to distinguish himself. In 1906, he was appointed aide-de-camp to President Theodore Roosevelt, a prestigious assignment that gave him exposure to the highest levels of government. He served in this capacity for 2 years, learning about politics and power at the national level. This experience would later inform his understanding of the relationship between military and civilian authority. In 1913, MacArthur participated in the Veracruz expedition, a military intervention in Mexico. He led a reconnaissance mission deep into hostile territory, gathering intelligence on enemy forces and railroad capabilities. The mission was dangerous and unauthorized, and MacArthur came under fire multiple times. He again was recommended for the Medal of Honor, and again the award was denied. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, MacArthur was a major serving on the Army General Staff in Washington. He was 37 years old and desperate to get into combat. He proposed the creation of a division composed of National Guard units from multiple states, a Rainbow Division that would represent the entire nation. The proposal was accepted, and the 42nd Rainbow Division was formed. MacArthur was promoted to colonel and appointed chief of staff of the new division. The Rainbow Division arrived in France in late 1917 and entered combat in early 1918. MacArthur proved to be an exceptional combat leader. He personally led raids into enemy trenches, often armed only with a riding crop and wearing a distinctive crushed cap rather than a helmet. His bravery bordered on recklessness. He seemed to court danger, exposing himself to enemy fire in ways that shocked even hardened combat veterans. He was gassed twice and wounded twice, but refused to leave the front. His leadership style was theatrical and personal. He led from the front, sharing the dangers faced by his men. Soldiers admired his courage even as they questioned his judgment. He was promoted to brigadier general in June 1918, becoming one of the youngest general officers in the American Expeditionary Force. MacArthur participated in all of the major American offensives of 1918. He fought in the Ace-Namarne campaign, the St. Mihiel offensive, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He commanded a brigade with distinction, demonstrating tactical skill and personal bravery. By the end of the war, he had been decorated 13 times and cited for bravery 7 additional times. He received the Distinguished Service Cross twice, the Distinguished Service Medal twice, and 7 Silver Stars. The French awarded him the Croix de Guerre twice. By the armistice in November 1918, MacArthur had been promoted to brigadier general and was commanding a division. He was 38 years old and had established himself as one of the Army's most decorated and promising officers. After the war, MacArthur was appointed superintendent of West Point. The academy had become stagnant and outdated, still operating much as it had in the 19th century. MacArthur instituted sweeping reforms. He modernized the curriculum, introduced new athletic programs, and liberalized the harsh disciplinary system. He updated military training to reflect lessons learned in the recent war. His reforms were controversial and faced resistance from traditionalists, but they transformed West Point into a modern military academy. He served as superintendent from 1919 to 1922, leaving a lasting mark on the institution. In 1922, MacArthur was sent back to the Philippines as commander of the military district of Manila. He spent the next 3 years in the islands, a period he would later describe as among the happiest of his life. He loved the Philippines and developed a deep attachment to the islands and their people that would influence his later career. In 1925, MacArthur was promoted to Major General, becoming the youngest officer of that rank in the Army. He served in various command and staff positions over the following years, including a stint as commander of the Philippine Department from 1928 to 1930. In 1930, MacArthur achieved the pinnacle of his profession when he was appointed Chief of Staff of the United States Army. At 50 years old, he was the youngest man ever to hold that position. He assumed command of an army that had been drastically reduced after World War I and was starved for funding during the Great Depression. MacArthur fought constantly for resources and modernization, clashing with civilian officials who wanted to cut military spending. His tenure as Chief of Staff was marked by controversy. In 1932, he led the forcible removal of the Bonus Army, a group of World War I veterans who had camped in Washington, demanding early payment of promised bonuses. MacArthur personally commanded troops who used tear gas and bayonets to drive the veterans from the capital. The incident was widely criticized and damaged his public reputation. MacArthur defended his actions as necessary to prevent insurrection, but many Americans saw the event as an example of military excess. Despite this controversy, MacArthur served as Chief of Staff until 1935, longer than any of his predecessors. He had fought to maintain the Army's strength and readiness during difficult economic times. When his term ended, he was offered retirement or assignment to the Philippines to help create a defense force for the Commonwealth, which was scheduled to gain independence. MacArthur chose the Philippines. In 1935, MacArthur returned to Manila as military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth. His mission was to create a Filipino army capable of defending the islands after independence. He threw himself into this task with characteristic energy and confidence. He was promoted to Field Marshal in the Philippine Army, a rank that had no equivalent in the American military. He designed elaborate uniforms and insignia and surrounded himself with ceremony and protocol. MacArthur's mother had died in 1935, finally releasing him from her dominating influence. In 1937, at age 57, he married Jean Faircloth, a woman 18 years his junior. The marriage was happy and enduring, lasting until his death. Jean provided stability and support throughout the remainder of his career. In 1938, they had a son, Arthur MacArthur IV, whom Douglas adored and doted upon with an affection he had shown few others in his life. MacArthur's work in the Philippines proceeded slowly. Resources were limited, and the task of creating a modern army from scratch was enormous. By 1941, he had made some progress, but the Philippine Defense Force was far from ready for serious combat. In July 1941, as war with Japan loomed, President Franklin Roosevelt recalled MacArthur to active duty in the U.S. Army and appointed him commander of United States Army forces in the Far East. He was given the mission of defending the Philippines against Japanese attack. When Japan attacked on December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, MacArthur's forces were caught unprepared. His air force was destroyed on the ground despite having hours of warning. The Japanese invasion proceeded rapidly, and MacArthur's forces were pushed back. He retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor, where American and Filipino forces made a desperate stand. MacArthur's defense of the Philippines was marked by both heroism and failure. His forces fought bravely against overwhelming odds, but they had been poorly prepared and positioned. MacArthur himself remained on Corregidor, sharing the danger with his men and issuing dramatic communiques that captured American attention. As the situation became hopeless, Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia. MacArthur was reluctant to leave his men, but he obeyed orders. In March 1942, he escaped from Corregidor by PT boat, leaving behind thousands of American and Filipino soldiers who would soon be forced to surrender. Upon reaching Australia, MacArthur made his famous statement, "I came through and I shall return." The promise to return to the Philippines became his obsession and his mission for the next 2.5 years. MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area. He now commanded all Allied operations in that vast theater. He immediately began planning the long campaign to push back the Japanese and eventually return to the Philippines. MacArthur's Pacific campaign from 1942 to 1945 was a masterpiece of strategy. He developed the technique of island hopping, bypassing heavily defended Japanese positions and seizing lightly defended areas to establish bases for further advances. This strategy saved countless American lives by avoiding frontal assaults on fortified positions. He worked closely with Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded naval forces in the Pacific, though the relationship was sometimes strained by MacArthur's ego and his insistence on primacy in the theater. MacArthur's advance through New Guinea and the Philippines was methodical and successful. He demonstrated strategic brilliance in selecting objectives and coordinating complex amphibious operations. His forces recaptured territory after territory, steadily pushing toward the Philippines. In October 1944, MacArthur fulfilled his promise. American forces landed at Leyte in the Philippines, and MacArthur waded ashore in a carefully staged photograph that became one of the iconic images of World War II. He had returned. The liberation of the Philippines took months of hard fighting, but by July 1945, the islands were secured. MacArthur was promoted to General of the Army, a 5-star rank, in December 1944. He was now one of the most famous military commanders in the world, celebrated for his strategic genius and his dramatic leadership style. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, MacArthur was designated Supreme Commander for the Allied powers and given responsibility for occupying and rebuilding Japan. This assignment would become the greatest achievement of his career. MacArthur ruled Japan with absolute authority from 1945 to 1951. He oversaw the demilitarization of Japanese society, the prosecution of war criminals, and the complete restructuring of Japanese government and economy. He imposed democratic reforms, gave women the right to vote, encouraged labor unions, broke up industrial monopolies, and oversaw the writing of a new constitution that renounced war forever. MacArthur's occupation of Japan was remarkably successful. He showed wisdom and restraint in dealing with a defeated enemy. He preserved the emperor as a symbol while stripping away his political power. He worked to rebuild Japanese society rather than simply punishing it. The Japanese people, who had been told to expect brutal treatment from the conquerors, instead found MacArthur to be fair and even benevolent. He became a revered figure in Japan, respected as the man who had defeated them but also helped them rebuild. MacArthur's proconsular rule in Japan was marked by the same theatrical style that had characterized his entire career. He lived in the American embassy, rarely left Tokyo, and governed through a small staff of loyal subordinates. He held court like a monarch, receiving visitors and issuing pronouncements. He was 65 years old when the occupation began, but he showed no signs of slowing down. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, beginning the Korean War. MacArthur was immediately appointed commander of United Nations forces sent to defend South Korea. The initial North Korean assault nearly drove UN forces off the peninsula. MacArthur's forces were pushed back to a small perimeter around the port of Pusan. The situation appeared desperate. MacArthur conceived a daring plan to reverse the situation. He proposed an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port near Seoul far behind North Korean lines. The plan was extremely risky. Incheon had terrible tides and narrow approaches that made it one of the worst possible sites for an amphibious assault. Military planners in Washington opposed the operation, but MacArthur insisted. In September 1950, the Incheon landing was executed brilliantly. UN forces came ashore and quickly captured Seoul, cutting North Korean supply lines and trapping much of their army in the south. It was one of the most successful amphibious operations in military history and demonstrated MacArthur's strategic genius at age 70. Following the success at Incheon, MacArthur's forces drove north, pushing the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel and continuing toward the Chinese border. MacArthur assured President Truman that China would not intervene in the war. He was wrong. In November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border, attacking UN forces and driving them back in one of the worst defeats in American military history. MacArthur's forces retreated in chaos, abandoning North Korea and falling back below Seoul. MacArthur wanted to expand the war, attacking Chinese bases in Manchuria and possibly using nuclear weapons. He publicly criticized the Truman administration's policy of limited war and advocated for total victory. He corresponded with Republican politicians who opposed Truman's policies and made statements to the press that contradicted administration policy. President Truman was furious at MacArthur's insubordination. The general was challenging civilian control of the military and undermining presidential authority. In April 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of all his commands. The dismissal shocked the nation. MacArthur was a national hero, and many Americans supported his position on the war. MacArthur returned to the United States for the first time in 14 years to a hero's welcome. Millions of people lined the streets to see him. He addressed a joint session of Congress in an emotional speech in which he quoted an old barracks ballad, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." The speech was a masterpiece of rhetoric and moved many listeners to tears. MacArthur briefly considered running for president in 1952, but his political support proved shallow. He had been away from America too long and was out of touch with domestic politics. He faded from public life, though he remained a revered figure. MacArthur spent his final years in New York City, living in the Waldorf Towers with his wife Jean and son Arthur. He served as chairman of the board of Remington Rand Corporation and occasionally made public appearances and speeches. He remained vigorous into his 80s, maintaining the erect bearing and commanding presence that had marked his entire life. In his final years, MacArthur mellowed somewhat. He spoke out against the Vietnam War, warning that land wars in Asia were unwinnable. He met with President Kennedy and advised caution in military commitments. The old warrior had learned from his own experiences the limits of military power. Douglas MacArthur died on April 5, 1964 at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. He was 84 years old. The cause of death was biliary cirrhosis. He had been hospitalized for several weeks and his family was with him at the end. His body lay in state at the Capitol and his funeral was attended by thousands. He was buried in Norfolk, Virginia, in a memorial that bears his name. MacArthur's legacy remains controversial. He was undoubtedly one of the greatest military strategists in American history. His Pacific campaign in World War II and his occupation of Japan were masterpieces of military and political leadership. His Incheon landing was a stroke of genius that changed the course of the Korean War, but he was also vain, egotistical, and insubordinate. He challenged civilian authority and believed himself above the rules that governed other officers. His certainty in his own judgment led to the disaster of Chinese intervention in Korea. He was theatrical to the point of self-parody, surrounding himself with ceremony and demanding adulation from subordinates. Modern historians recognize MacArthur as a complex figure who embodied both the best and worst qualities of military leadership. He was brilliant but arrogant, courageous but vain, visionary but stubborn. He achieved extraordinary things but also made serious mistakes. His life spanned the period from the Indian Wars to the nuclear age, and he participated in shaping American military history throughout that era. Perhaps the most balanced assessment of Douglas MacArthur is that he was a great general but a difficult man. His strategic genius was matched by his ego. His courage was matched by his theatricality. He could inspire tremendous loyalty in his subordinates while simultaneously alienating his superiors. He represented an older model of military leadership, the great captain who led through force of personality and individual genius. In the end, Douglas MacArthur was neither simply a hero nor simply a failure, but rather an extraordinary individual whose talents and flaws were both magnified by the enormous responsibilities he carried. His legacy includes brilliant victories, successful occupation policies, and important contributions to American military doctrine. He is remembered today as one of the giants of American military history, a figure whose life and career continue to fascinate and provoke debate decades after his death.